Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg. Also with me on the set is our international affairs commentator Douglas Herbert. Secretary-General, thank you so much for your time. You and I are old enough to remember the Cold War. Things we thought were unthinkable a week ago now seem highly plausible. Do you fear this war could spill over to a NATO member state?
First of all, it's not possible to not be moved and really feel pain when we see the pictures from all the suffering taking place in Ukraine, the civilians killed and the devastating damage we see across the country. NATO's main responsibility is, of course, to protect and defend all allies, and therefore we have a responsibility to make sure that this conflict doesn't escalate further and beyond Ukraine and involve NATO allied countries, and that's the reason why we have significantly increased the presence of NATO forces in the eastern part of the alliance, on land, at sea and in the air, to send a very clear message to Moscow that we are there to defend and protect all allies, and by that preserving peace and preventing an attack on a NATO allied country.
Yeah, Secretary General, you've been very clear that NATO is a defensive alliance. It is not the aggressor in this conflict, and it does not seek to be. It is not a party to this conflict. I'm curious, how much are you concerned, you and your associates in NATO, about an accidental confrontation that could lead to an escalation, obviously an unwanted escalation? And it doesn't seem that far-fetched, given what we have seen, the scenes we've seen on the battlefield, on the ground, the bombardment of Ukrainian cities. Vladimir Putin has shown he doesn't necessarily need to be provoked to accuse NATO of being the aggressor. How much are you concerned about an accidental confrontation that could lead to an escalation?
We need to make every effort to prevent an incident or an accident from happening that involves NATO allied countries. And if it happens, to make sure that it doesn't spiral out of control and create something which is even worse than what we see today, and that's a full-fledged war involving NATO and Russia. And that's the reason why we also are absolutely adamant that we need military lines of communications, deconfliction with Russia, to make sure that we minimize the risks for incidents, accidents, and also that we are able to handle them if they happen. So our main focus now is, of course, to call on Russia to end the war, to withdraw all its forces and to provide support to Ukraine, but also, of course, make sure that we prevent any further escalation into NATO allied countries.
Now, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has asked for Europe to send his country fighter jets to help stop the Russian invasion. I'm curious to know where things stand on that front, and if that happens, who is actually going to fly those planes?
NATO allies have provided support to Ukraine for many years, especially since 2014, when Ukraine was invaded for the first time. And allies have trained tens of thousands of Ukrainian troops, provided anti-tank weapons, air missile defense systems, and many other types of military equipment. And all of this proves now to be extremely important because this is helping the courageous armed forces of Ukraine to stand up against the invading Russian forces. And the Ukrainian army is much better equipped, much better trained, much larger now than in 2014. We will continue, and we continue to provide them with support. I will not go into the details about exactly what kind of support the different NATO allies provide, but we are providing, and allies are stepping up the support to Ukraine.
You talk about the providing of the support, and this is obviously a pillar of what NATO can do in Ukraine if it can't send troops or boots on the ground. My question is, how are these weapons getting to the battlefield? Logistically, how is NATO getting them there? Who is taking the weapons to the battlefield? And once they are there in the hands of the Ukrainian forces, how long does it take before they're able to actually use these weapons and make them sort of operationally effective?
I am very careful going into details about that, partly because it can actually undermine the efforts of allies to provide support. But allies have announced that equipment has reached the Ukrainian armed forces. But beyond that, I will not go into details, because what matters now is that allies deliver support and that we help and support the fighting troops, forces of Ukraine. The courage they show, the courage the Ukrainian population demonstrates, and also the courage and the commitment of President Zelensky and the Ukrainian leadership inspires the whole world to step up support. And it's extremely important that we actually now deliver both military support but also humanitarian support and financial support to Ukraine.
But the situation, Secretary-General, reveals what an invidious position NATO has found itself in. So I'm just wanting to know, what can NATO do, given the fears that anything it does could result in a much bigger and dangerous war?
Well, we have been planning for this and preparing for this actually for a long time, because NATO intelligence, especially the United States, predicted this could happen many months ago, we engaged and tried to in tireless efforts to find a political solution, but President Putin decided to use military force again against Ukraine. Therefore, allies have over the last weeks and months have increased their support to Ukraine, but we also made it clear that we are not going into Ukraine with NATO troops or NATO planes in the airspace of Ukraine. We help them to uphold the right for self-defense. That is the right of every sovereign nation enshrined in the UN Charter. So we do that, but we are not part of the conflict by deploying NATO troops on the ground or NATO planes in the air.
The Russian Foreign Ministry has warned that any bid by Finland and Sweden to join the alliance, to draw closer to the alliance, would have, quote, and I'm quoting them, serious military and political consequences. How do you respond to Russia?
That's a totally unacceptable statement from Russia, because it violates the core principle for our security, that every nation has the right to choose its own path, whether it wants to belong to or not to belong to an alliance as NATO. And NATO enlargement have helped to spread democracy, freedom throughout Europe for decades, since the end of the Cold War. And I absolutely respect the sovereign right of Finland and Sweden to decide their own future. I respect them if they decide not to apply for membership, but if they apply for membership, of course they have the right to join NATO. That's for Finland and Sweden and the 30 allies to decide, not Russia. And this message that they now use more and more, that if we don't meet their demands, they will be what Russia calls military technical consequences, is a way to try to intimidate, threaten sovereign nations in Europe. Russia does this to try to get less NATO, but they get more NATO close to the borders when they behave the way they do. They try to divide us, but they get a more united NATO, including that we stand in very close unity with Finland and Sweden. Finland and Sweden are extremely close partners, never been closer. They attended the meeting today, and that just demonstrates that Russia gets the opposite. President Putin gets the opposite of what he aspires for, and that's more NATO and a stronger NATO and more unity.
Finally, Secretary-General, apart from French President Emmanuel Macron talking to Vladimir Putin, is there anybody else within the alliance talking to the Russian leader?
Well, we have a military alliance of communications to deconflict, to reduce the risks of miscalculations, incidents and accidents. And allies have, of course, also made it clear that we are ready to engage in serious political talks. But at the same time, we have to see that Russia is serious about diplomatic efforts. And so far, they have chosen war, armed forces, instead of serious diplomatic efforts.
Jens Stoltenberg, thank you again very much for your time. And we've